because very often they face this problem where they do their level best to produce the best embryos. They look at the endometrium, it looks excellent, but after transfer, we do not get pregnancies. And we really don't understand how we should treat this patient next. So today, whatever research is available, we are trying to throw some light on these research papers. Let us see how much they stand the test of time. But I'm going to discuss almost all the research available on recurrent implantation failure uh, on today's date. Well, implantation is a play between an embryo and the endometrium. The endometrium allows the embryo to grow in it just up to the basal plate of this endometrial tissue, but doesn't allow the trophoblastic tissue to go beyond the basal plate into the myometrium. And this whole play is because of the hormonal changes occurring in the endometrium and the changes in the endometrium brought about by a healthy embryo. So a healthy embryo secretes certain substances which we are going to discuss about, which we can measure and know whether our embryo is at fault in implantation, or an endometrium whose immunology or the the estrogen or the progesterone receptors are at fault, because of which our embryo, even being good, has failed to implant. Well, so how do we define recurrent implantation failure? By definition, the term implantation failure can be used to describe both patients who have never shown a rise in HCG and those who have shown a rise in HCG without the presence of a gestational sac. But this doesn't solve our problem. It doesn't include everything. So another definition given by Cohen et al. Says that recurrent implantation failure is failure of clinical pregnancy after 4 good quality embryos have been transferred with at least 3 fresh or frozen IVF cycles in women less than 40 years of age. So we say 4 good blastocysts in women less than 40 years, because nowadays single embryo transfer has become a norm in the Western countries. They are saying 3 or 4 fresh or frozen IVF cycles before they label a woman having recurrent implantation failure. So what could be the causes? Why do these embryos, which are growing so well in our laboratory, fail to implant? So causes could be genetic, they could be anatomical, they could be endocrinological, like hypothyroidism, diabetes in the woman. They could be related to the lifestyle, woman's lifestyle, like smoking, alcohol, her large body mass index, stress. She could be carrier of a thrombophilic disorder like factor V Leiden and so on. There could be an abnormal microbiome inside her uterine cavity, or her endometrial receptivity date is pushed forward or backward. The type of HCG molecule produced by the embryo may be faulty. It could be because of adenomyosis or endometriosis, leading to certain immunological changes in the endometrium. It could be another cause, immunological cause, like altered NK cells in the endometrium or chronic endometritis. Let us look at all these factors one by one and how we can tackle them and individualize our patients to treat them successfully in order to solve their problem of recurrent implantation failure. So maternal age is one of the most important factor, and we cannot compare implantation of embryos in a woman who is less than 35 compared to the one who is more than 44 years, because implantation rates are 41% in less than 35 years age women and just 1.9% once she crosses 44 years of age. Rate of now recently now so much research has been going on that yes, there is a problem in the endometrium and that is why our good embryos are not implanting. Whenever a patient of IVF fails, all that we tell her is your embryo doesn't stick to the uterus. But in a recent study, a very recent paper in Fertility Sterility in 2021 January, they have said that most of the implantation failures are because of a problem in the embryo. So what they did is, in their study, they found that after doing a pre-implantation genetic screening of the embryonic genome, and also for, I mean, an aneuploidy plus a genome study, they found that the implantation rate in healthy blastocysts was as high as 94%. And within 3 cycles, most of the patients, almost all the patients, only a small group failed to conceive, showing that the best blastocysts will definitely implant. And it's a very, very small group which may suffer from implantation failure. So let us have a look at this small group. Like we all know that if we see something very gross in the endometrium, like a polyp or a fibroid or a septum or adhesions, we are not going to transfer our embryos unless we correct this pathology, or we see a thin endometrium or a very thick endometrium. So forget the pathology. But in a very normal, good looking endometrium, if healthy blastocysts fail to implant, there is still a small group of patients having certain supple abnormalities on which we are going to show or throw some light today. We know that this process of implantation is quite complicated. The endometrial tissue has got the surface glands or epithelial cells. When they dip inside the stroma, they become glands. In response to estrogen, there is a proliferation of these glands and also of the stromal cells. And in response to progesterone, after estrogen priming of this endometrium, there is a secretory change. That is, the stromal cells proliferate and the glandular cells become secretory. There is edema in the stromal tissue. And by day 6 of fertilization, the endometrium becomes extremely receptive to the embryo. This is because the embryo itself starts secreting certain factors by virtue of which the embryo sticks to the endometrium, which we have discussed in the last lecture. That is, the mucin produced by the epithelial cells is removed by the secretions of cytotropoblasts. The integrins allow adhesion of the embryo to the endometrium, and further the NK cells, they cause pro and anti-inflammatory reactions in the endometrium, by virtue of which the cytos and the syncytiotropoplasts, they tear open the spiral arterioles and start growing like roots in water, and that is placentation. And a fibrinous cytoskeleton also appears around these tropoblastic villi, forming the placenta. So all this reaction is like, there are certain immune cells inside the endometrium which are protecting the placenta, and there are certain which are rejecting the placenta. And an imbalance in these is going to cause an implantation failure in the small group that we are discussing about. So the first type of cell which is responsible for failure of implantation is an altered natural killer cell activity inside the endometrium. Now, these natural killer cells are the innate immune cells. They kill leukemic cell lines. The ones in the endometrium have a surface glycoprotein which is called as CD56. And it is found even in the peripheral blood, but in higher concentrations inside the endometrium. But if its concentrations are too high, that is more than 250 cells per high power field, probably these are the patients who will land into recurrent implantation failure. And how do we find out this NK cell? Can we find it out by histopathology? No. We have to know these cells from immunohistochemistry. That is, an immune marker is put on the surface of the cell, and in the histopathology slide per high power field, how many cells have got marked is checked. And if this cell concentration is more than 250, probably altered natural killer cell concentration inside the endometrium is responsible for failure of implantation. Now, what is this Th2 and Th1 type of immune cytokines, TNF alpha levels inside the endometrium? We know that there are T lymphocytes inside the endometrium. Actually, all these inflammatory cells are in a very high concentration in the endometrium, and around implantation, their concentration further increases. Now, there are the T cells are called as the T helper cells, and they can go into any direction. They can become T helper cell type 1 or T helper cell type 2, depending upon what are the secretions coming from the embryo or the surroundings in the uterine cavity. So if there is infection in the uterine cavity, we will have a Th1 type of T helper cell. That is, the T cells are converted to Th1 helper cells, and they produce different cytokines. That is, they produce tumor necrosis factor alpha, or those cytokines which cause an inflammatory response, thrombosis, vascular inflammation, and therefore recurrent implantation failure. Now, T helper cell type 2 produce an anti-inflammatory type of response, and this is in response to a specific type of HCG produced by the embryo. And these cytokines reduce activity of Th1 or T helper cell type 1. They reduce the production of tumor necrosis factor alpha. These cells encourage embryo implantation. They secrete IL-4, IL-6, IL-10 type of cytokines. Both Th1 and Th2 immune cell cytokines are required in proportion for implantation. But when their proportion changes, that is, when we have more of T helper cell type 1 activity, more of tumor necrosis factor alpha compared to IL-4, IL-6, IL-10 cytokines, probably there is a rejection or failure of implantation. Women with RIF have a higher ratio of TNF versus IL-4. So TNF is produced by T helper cell 1, then and IL-4 is produced by T helper cell 2. Similarly, if we see the ratio of TNF with IL-6, again that is raised, or that with IL-10. So if the products from T helper cell 1 are high, they are going to reject implantation. Now, autoantibodies. Several autoantibodies are present in many women. We know that our women suffering from pregnancy-induced hypertension, anti-cardiolipin antibodies, anti-beta-2 glycoprotein 1 are found disproportionately high in these women. Not only that, but those suffering from other autoantibodies like anti-nuclear antibodies also suffer from recurrent implantation failure and recurrent pregnancy loss. It is shown that anti-cardiolipin antibody directly attacks the embryo. ACL, around 30% of women who had recurrent implantation failure have been tested positive for either of the antiphospholipid antibodies like anti-beta-2 glycoprotein or anti-phosphatidylserine or anti-phosphatidylinositol or anti-cardiolipin, etc., showing that they have a strong association with recurrent implantation failure. Now, hereditary thrombophilias. We know that a small percentage of patients suffer from hereditary thrombophilias where there is clotting in their microcirculation. Actually, this clotting is because their clot lysis mechanism is improper due to certain single gene disorders. So we have MTHFR gene deficiency or factor V Leiden deficiency or prothrombin deficiency or antithrombin 3 deficiency. Many of these patients will give us a history of deep vein thrombosis or for which they may be on anticoagulants. But really, whether this is responsible for recurrent implantation failure or responsible for recurrent miscarriages, more studies are required in this field. Now, chronic endometritis. All these years, we thought that the endometrium is a sterile area. But recently, with the advent of NGS technology, and we use the 16S ribosomal RNA to detect our microbiome, it is shown that there is a microbiome in our endometrial cavity also, just as it is in our gut, vagina. We also have a microbiome in our endometrial cavity. And this microbiome could be commensals or they could be pathogens. When they are pathogens, they evoke a Th1 type of response rejecting implantation. But when they are commensals like lactobacilli, they evoke a Th2 type of response encouraging implantation. So whenever we are doing a hysteroscopy, it's always good to take a DNC and send it to our pathologist to do a immunohistochemistry staining. And if the CD138, these are plasma cells, their levels are high or much more than normal, then probably there is inflammation in the endometrium, which we may not see either on ultrasound, and we may not even see it on hysteroscopy. We may sometimes see strawberry like patches, but this is a very accurate way to diagnose chronic endometritis, and it should be treated before we transfer our embryos inside the uterine cavity. Well, uh, we have just discussed that we can have commensals or we can have pathogenic bacteria inside the endometrial cavity. Let us understand that the sperms swim up in the endometrial cavity, and the tail of the sperm carries the bacteria which are present in the semen. And many men who have urinary tract infections, urinary stones, prostatitis, urethritis, or venereal diseases, sexually transmitted diseases, they will have these bacteria into their semen, and the sperm tails will carry them up into the endometrial cavity where they may lodge and evoke an inflammatory response. Now, lactobacilli are commensals, and we said that they evoke a Th2 type of cytokine response in the endometrial cavity, favoring implantation. Whereas bacteria like Streptococcus, E. coli, Mycoplasma, Chlamydia, they are responsible for recurrent implantation failure, and also later in pregnancy responsible for premature rupture of membranes, irritable uterus, and preterm labor. The new techniques like PCR and NGS or microarray will become a standard for diagnosis of infection as a cause of recurrent implantation failure. Now, I told you that there are specific substances produced by the embryo which evoke a positive inflammatory response in the endometrium. And what is this specific substance? We all know that the cytotropoblasts produce human chorionic gonadotrophin. And in the first 3 weeks of embryonic life, they produce hyperglycosylated HCG. Now, what is this hyperglycosylated HCG? It is similar to our human chorionic gonadotrophin, having a higher level of glycosylation and a higher half-life. This HHCG level, if seen 6 days after a blastocyst transfer, if its level is more than 300 IU, it indicates that we are actually going to have a pregnancy, and a healthy pregnancy, and a very high beta HCG level will be seen when she comes to us on her day 14 post ET. If the level on day 6 of blastocyst transfer is between 75 to 300, probably it would be a biochemical pregnancy. The embryo is not very healthy and it is not secreting the amount of HHCG that it should be secreting. If this level is less than 75, probably we are not going to get a pregnancy. Now, leukemia inhibitory factor. This is one more cytokine which we can check. This is a cytokine belonging to the interleukin 6 family, and women with recurrent implantation failure have lower production of LIF in the secretory phase compared to the follicular phase. So what they have done is they have done DNCs during the follicular phase and checked the level of IL-6 in it, and they have checked in the same cycle in the secretory phase, or in the next cycle in the secretory phase, that is 6 days after or 7 days after ovulation. And they found that in women who had recurrent implantation failure, the level was high in the follicular phase but low in the secretory phase. And those women who had an implantation, a healthy implantation, had high levels both during the follicular and the secretory phase. Now, prostaglandins are required for implantation, and we have two types of prostaglandin synthesizing enzymes, that is cytosolic phospholipase A and COX-2 and secretory phospholipase A2 are known. Now, in implantation failure, the cytosolic phospholipase A2 and COX-2 are decreased, whereas the secretory phospholipase A2, which is outside the cells, is increased. So these can be tested in the endometrium in that small group of women where we are not finding anything as a cause of recurrent implantation failure. Similarly, we have cell adhesion molecules known as integrins, alpha V B3, alpha 4B1, and alpha 1B1. These are the chief adhesion molecules by virtue of which the embryo adheres to the endometrium. And it is seen that the alpha V B3 in the luminal epithelium of those women who become pregnant, the levels are very high. The expression is very high in the secretory phase, that is on day 6 of day 7 or day 8 of ovulation. So if you take a biopsy 8 days after ovulation from the endometrium and you check it for expression of alpha VB3 in the luminal epithelial cells, that expression will be very high in those women who show good implantation, whereas it will be low in those who show implantation failure. There was also statistically greater expression of alpha 4B1 integrin in the glandular epithelium in those women who did not become pregnant or who showed implantation failure. So we need the good integrin, that is alpha V B3 for implantation, and we do not need alpha 4B1 in higher levels for implantation. In summary, in order to know whether we are going to get implantation or not, we can check certain molecules. One is hyperglycosylated HCG, that can be checked in the blood or in the urine. And on day 6 of transferring blastocysts, if its levels are high, probably we have a healthy embryo which will implant inside the endometrium. If its levels are low, as we just discussed, we may get a biochemical pregnancy or we may not get an implantation. And the reason could be our embryo is not healthy enough to implant. Similarly, cytosolic phospholipase A2 in the endometrium, if the levels are high, we are going to get implantation. If low, we are not going to get implantation. Leukemia inhibitory factor in secretory and proliferative phase, if its action in the endometrium is high in the proliferative and low in the secretory, we may not get implantation, and equal in secretory and proliferative, we are going to get implantation. And as we said, the integrin alpha B3 integrin, if its levels are high, we will get implantation, and if these levels are low, we will not get implantation. And many of these things can be tested in the endometrium and the blood to pinpoint the cause of implantation failure. But all these are at research level. At our level, at least we can see the hyperglycosylated HCG 6 days after blastocyst transfer in order to know at least whether we have given a healthy embryo to our patient. Now in gross, on ultrasound, before we transfer our embryos, we check each and every patient's endometrium as a rule. We look at the myometrium, we look at the endometrium, we look at the junction between the endometrium and the myometrium, we look at the thickness of the endometrium. And we know whenever we see any such pathology like a polyp, a myoma, a band of adhesion, we will not transfer the embryos. And we would first correct these pathologies and only then go for embryo transfer. A study has shown that there is a relation between all these uterine anomalies and recurrent implantation failure and recurrent spontaneous abortions, where the most responsible cause for recurrent implantation failure is a submucous fibroid. So 13.2% women with recurrent implantation failure had a submucous fibroid, and recurrent spontaneous abortion for that intrauterine and supple intrauterine adhesions are responsible, where 10.4% women with recurrent spontaneous abortions had minor intrauterine adhesions. Now, we know that hydrosalpinx also prevents implantation because the infected fluid keeps leaking inside the endometrial cavity, producing a inflammatory response or a Th1 type of a response. So removing hydrosalpinx would improve implantation. Uh, Uterine blood flow may be altered. Women who are hypertensive, or in women who are smokers, or for all congenital reasons, we do not know. Some may just have a decreased blood flow into their radial arteries, uterine arteries, and radial arteries, and therefore their VEGF production is low. Therefore, their endometrial growth is low, and many times they suffer from a thin endometrium. So thin endometrium itself can be a cause of implantation failure. Either the endometrium is damaged because of curettage, damaged because of any chronic infection like tuberculosis, or because of long-term use of oral contraceptive pills or impaired uterine blood flow. All of them can be a reason of thin endometrium, and in any endometrium less than 6 millimeters, the chances of implantation are extremely low. Now we know that this is a very dynamic process. How the embryo implants, so many molecules are generated, either peptides, proteins, glycoproteins, in pro-inflammatory, anti-inflammatory, adhesion molecules. So for production of all these proteins, the genes have to be upregulated. And it has been found that 333 genes have been studied, or they have been found to be predictive of patients in recurrent implantation failure. These are genes which are responsible for cell cycle growth or cell cycle regulation, cell division, cytoskeleton formation, cilia formation, and production of the vital molecules required for implantation. And this has been the basis, studying these genes, whether they are upregulated 7 days after ovulation or not. Studying these genes will tell us what is the timing when we should transfer the embryos, and that is called as a endometrial receptivity assay, or also called as personalized embryo transfer. That is, somebody's window may open after 5 days and close off by day 6, whereas the other patient's embryos, the window may open on day 8 and close off on day 9. But majority of the women have a wide window of implantation from day 5 of progesterone to day 8 of progesterone. Now, what therapeutic interventions we will do, and what will be the basis of our therapeutic interventions? So the first thing is, we know that there are two in this game, the embryo and the endometrium. And we know that the embryo plays a major role in implantation failure as compared to the endometrium. So what can we do? First of all, instead of going for a day 3 transfer, we should go for a blastocyst transfer, because on day 3, the implantation window is rarely open, and therefore the implantation rate of cleavage stage embryo is hardly 12%, and that of blastocyst is 25%. Apart from that, not all cleavage stage embryos will become blastocysts. Hardly 50% of the cleavage stage embryos will become blastocyst. So we have a better selection by doing the blastocyst transfer. Besides that, the uterus is more quiet on day 5 or 6 of progesterone as compared to day 3 of progesterone. So Shapiro et al. Also determined that implantation rate was, and clinical pregnancy rate and ongoing pregnancy rate, all were more in frozen embryo transfer as compared to fresh embryo transfer. Now, what is the reason? The reason is, whenever we stimulate the ovaries, probably we also give the endometrium unphysiological levels of estrogen, and then we add progesterone. All of this can change the window of implantation or may reduce implantation. Recently, in the few years, a few 3 or 4 years of our curriculum, we are seeing that people go to study the progesterone level before or on the day of HCG in order to know whether this endometrium has advanced because of our ovarian stimulation. and they have taken a cutoff of 1.5 as the level of progesterone. If progesterone on day of HCG is more than 1.5, we will freeze the embryos and transfer in the next cycle. And if it is less than 1.5, then probably it will not have, or the stimulation will not have any effect on our embryo transfer and implantation rate. Now, transfer methods. Well, I wouldn't say that this is an implantation failure or something. It is that the embryo never reached the endometrium, either because we did not actually put it in the endometrium. So we should be having an ultrasound guidance. Some woman may have a very long cervix, and we may just put the embryos in the cervical canal, or we may go right into the ostia, or we may make a false passage and go elsewhere. All this has happened in difficult transfers where the cavity or the canal is having varied shapes or varied directions. We may just uh, we may have to use a rigid catheter, which may also be responsible for forming a false passage. Sometimes the cervical mucus gets pushed along with the catheter, and we put the embryos on the cervical mucus instead of putting it on the endometrial tissue. And this itself may be a cause of failure. When best embryos are put, they will not be able to sustain unless they are in contact with the endometrial epithelial cells. So removing the cervical mucus before embryo transfer is also a very important step. Now, progesterone. This is one of the most vital molecules responsible for implantation. We know that if we do not give progesterone, patient fails to take progesterone, or patient does not have the proper progesterone receptors, the best embryos will not implant. It is progesterone that brings about the secretory changes in the stromal cells. It is progesterone that brings about all the immunological cells that flush inside the uh, endometrial epithelium at the time of implantation, allowing the breakage of the spiral arterioles, the invasion of the cyto and the syncytiotropoblast into the spiral arterioles. So progesterone is one of the most important molecules, and one must see that patient receives a proper progesterone after embryo transfer. All patients who have got a stimulated cycle will have a luteal phase defect, and therefore support with progesterone after embryo transfer is very, very essential. We can give pure progesterone in oil, oral, vaginal, intramuscular, or dydrogesterone orally. The only advantage of dydrogesterone is it is very well tolerated, it has less side effects, and it is as effective as pure progesterone in oil. In my curriculum, I have seen one patient whose endometrium would never become progestational. However hard we tried, giving her 200 milligrams of intramuscular progesterone every day, but still the endometrium looked only triple line. And after doing her a research study on her, we realized that she lacked progesterone receptor genes. And that is why she was a patient for surrogacy, because unless progesterone acted on the endometrium, we would never give her a pregnancy. Now, antithrombotic agents. This is, I think, we keep it only for those patients who are either having acquired or congenital thrombophilic disorders like APL syndrome, ANA, or they are having these factor V laden and or the other thrombophilic disorders. Or in otherwise in routine practice, addition of low molecular weight heparin may not improve our implantation rate. Now, immunotherapy. I told you we are all struggling for that group of patients where we know that our embryo was healthy. In the few years past decade, we know that pre-implantation genetic diagnosis for aneuploidy testing was very common, and everyone was very sure that this embryo has all the 24 chromosomes, and we do not have to pairs of chromosomes, and we do not have to worry at all. But still implantation failed. And it is this small group which required immunotherapy. But we cannot jump on immunotherapy unless we prove that yes, this is a patient where we have put proper embryos at least 2 or 3 times and still implantation has not occurred. Then we go to find out whether her NK cells are inside her endometrium or in her peripheral blood are raised, or whether she has a Th1, Th2 imbalance by seeing the activity of tumor necrosis factor alpha, or by seeing the levels of IL-6, IL-4, IL-10, and then coming to a conclusion that yes, we need to modulate her immunity in order to give her a proper or a healthy pregnancy or implantation. So there have been studies on this new drug called tacrolimus. Tacrolimus is a immunosuppressive drug. It is used in graft rejection patients, and it is found that this is quite safe in early pregnancy. We can give it in early pregnancy, or we may just give it till implantation has been achieved in those patients who have higher or elevated Th1 Th2 ratio from the cytokine study which we have just discussed. What was seen in this study by Japanese IVF specialist, he said that those who received tacrolimus, 45.7% achieved success, whereas in these patients with high Th1 Th2 ratio, only 0% achieved implantation who did not receive any immunomodulating agent, or he did not use tacrolimus. Now, IV immunoglobulins. IVIG treatment also has been regarded as a possible immunological therapy for women suffering from recurrent implantation failure with elevated Th1, Th2 ratios. So, how is this IVIG given? IVIG is given 2 days prior to embryo transfer. The first and the second dose is given, and here we give 5 grams of IVIG, 2.5 on the first day and 2.5 on the second day in half normal saline, and keep all the emergency drugs ready because of any patient can get an anaphylactic reaction. So a meta-analysis by Lee et al. They showed that effect of IVIG administration on implantation rate in 6 studies. The implantation rate was 34% in patients who received IVIG and only 13% who did not. These are patients with altered immunity in their endometrium. Clinical pregnancy occurred in 60.2% of patients treated with IVIG as compared to 39% who did not receive IVIG. Now, peripheral blood mononuclear cells. The peripheral blood mononuclear cells consist of B lymphocyte, T lymphocytes, monocytes. These cells produce many cytokines that have been known to improve endometrial receptivity during implantation. So PBMC injection via intrauterine insemination catheter before embryo transfer greatly improved the outcome of implantation in those who had previously suffered from implantation failure. So you et al. Confirmed that implantation rate was significantly higher in the group treated with intrauterine administration of peripheral blood mononuclear cells than in the control group, that is 23 versus 11%. Now, granulocyte colony stimulating factor. This is another cytokine. It causes growth. It causes growth of the endometrial epithelium. So it is seen that in those patients who had a thin endometrium or who had recurrent implantation failure, this drug given intrauterine worked or showed magical results. Lee et al. Conducted a meta-analysis which determined that GCSF use in women with thin endometrium or with recurrent IVF failure had higher implantation rate. However, this did not receive it does not reach statistical significance. Now, what are the additional treatments that we see to allow the endometrium to grow? They are vitamin E to improve the blood flow, leading to increased endometrial proliferation, sildenafil, which improves the blood flow of the endometrium. And this has been reported that many of these drugs like vitamin E, sildenafil, estrogens, they allow or improve blood flow and growth of the endometrium and give a pregnancy of almost 70% in patients undergoing IVF. What about antibiotics? We know that our endometrium can be infected and giving antibiotics for gram positive and gram negative bacteria will change our implantation rate. The best way to diagnose this is now a chip is available where we just take the endometrial sample or the endometrial fluid prior to our IVF cycle and do a NGS on it and get the names of all the bacterial genome present in our endometrium. We treat that with specific antibiotics and then go for embryo transfer, where we see very high implantation rates in those patients who were positive for bacterial infections and has been treated completely with antibiotics. So women with mycoplasma, they received minocycline, and women where the infection was cured, I said amoxicillin, clavulanic acid, ciprofloxacillin, all can be used depending upon which bacteria is found. And once the infection is cured, the implantation rate is statistically much higher than in those patients where infection went unnoticed. So there is currently a clinical trial in the University of Valencia in Spain, recruiting participants aiming to find out a new non-invasive diagnostic test for chronic endometritis using bacterial DNA. I told you that that 16S ribosomal RNA way is the way to separate the bacterial genome or the bacterial DNA from the maternal DNA. And then after we do an NGS, we get all the phyla of bacteria in our sample, and then we treat them with specific antibiotics and get the best implantation rates in women suffering from recurrent implantation failure. Anatomical interventions we have just discussed, removing polyps, myoma, adhesion, septae, would definitely improve implantation, and one should never proceed for implantation even if you see a minor problem inside the endometrium. Patients with adenomyosis, if you see an abnormal endomyometrial junction, then it is better to downregulate the uterus in 3 or 4 cycles till the adenomyosis becomes completely quiet, and then prepare the endometrium and then transfer the embryos. So this is about correction of polyps. Implantation rate is definitely higher in women where we remove a polyp and then transfer the embryos. About hydrosalpinx, we said salpingectomy will improve our pregnancy rate. Standard et al. Found that implantation rate as well as clinical pregnancy rate and delivery rate in patients with bilateral hydrosalpinx removed were after treating with salpingectomy, this increased implantation rate and ongoing pregnancy rate increased dramatically. So we should not leave hydrosalpinx behind and do a embryo transfer. Now, what about so much is going on about endometrial scratch or endometrial injury? So what does it do? I think it alters the immune profile of the endometrium, allowing fresh blood flow to come, allowing the basal cells to grow in a much better manner, allowing decidualization to happen, and therefore increasing implantation. One mechanism, they say, is by an increase in the local cytokines involved in wound healing, like leukemia inhibitory factor and IL-11. Now, we just discussed about endometrial receptivity array, and that is implantation relies on a crosstalk between the embryo and the endometrium, with facilitation by many different factors like growth factors, cytokines. So all these cells are extremely active. Their transcription factors and their DNA are constantly producing certain important molecules responsible for implantation. And if those genes are not upregulated on day 7 or 8 of progesterone, probably implantation will fail to occur on that day. So ERA is a test where we take endometrial biopsy samples on day 5, day 7 of after starting progesterone or after ovulation in a non or a pre-IVF cycle. And we know whether those 238 genes that we are looking for have been upregulated or not. How do they find out upregulation? So what they do is they take the mRNA, and from mRNA they make cDNA, And then they know, yes, if this cDNA is available, that means the mRNA was there. And if mRNA was there, that means the gene was upregulated. And this they see for 238 genes. If they are upregulated on day 5 of the progesterone, then we should do an endometrial or the embryo transfer on day 5. If they are upregulated on day 8, we should do an embryo transfer on day 8. So by personalized embryo transfer, success rate of patients with recurrent implantation failure has dramatically improved to almost say 60 to 70%. So that is how we find out the exact window of implantation in this small group of patients who do not have a wide window of implantation. Now, besides that, we are not just the uterus and the endometrium and the embryo. We are dealing with a living human life, and her entire lifestyle, her emotions, her diet, exercise, and her feeling of happiness and reward matters in her success in whatever she does in her life. And so, lifestyle modification is very important in our patients undergoing IVF. We must tell them to have a healthy diet, exercise, have happy get togethers, and have a more confident lifestyle. And if we have good results in our lab, patients definitely have the confidence and they remain happy, and that reward system is available in order to give them a successful implantation and all the immunological changes required for a pregnancy. So many IVF centers in the world have de-stressing rooms where they have music or light dance or some light shows which relaxes the woman and allows them to have a better implantation or remove the stress that they are going through during an IVF cycle. So our immunomodulators which we can use only in women who have altered immunity in their endometrium. We should not use it as a generalized treatment. So we can use tacrolimus. So what is the implantation rate in these treated patients is 45% in those who had a higher Th1 Th2 ratio, whereas the clinical pregnancy rate is 64% and birth outcome is 60% and 0% in non-treated patients. The IVIG study shows 34% success for implantation, clinical pregnancy rate 60%, and live birth 49%. Peripheral blood mononuclear cells 22% success rate in treated patients, 39% pregnancy rate, and 33% take home baby rate. GCSF 31% implantation, 48% clinical pregnancy rate, and 33% live birth rate. Treatment with antibiotics in chronic endometritis, 37% implantation rate, whereas only 17% in non-treated. Clinical pregnancy rate 65% and 60% take-home baby rate. Salpingectomy gives 25% implantation rate compared to 12% in those who do not undergo salpingectomy for hydrosalpinx. 45% clinical pregnancy rate and 40% live birth rate. Endometrial biopsy, 27% implantation rate, 66% clinical pregnancy rate, and 48% take home baby rate. So, these are all the techniques that we use to modulate the immunity in women where the endometrial immune system is not working properly, leading to recurrent implantation failure. So, in short, if we put it together, we know that our implantation can fail because of maternal factors like anatomical defects in the uterus. So, what are we going to do? If she has a hydrosalpinx, remove. If she has a fibroid more than 4 centimeters, remove. If it's a polyp, remove. Okay. And if it is a thin endometrium, work on that endometrium to allow it to grow. We will have a different topic or a different lecture on thin endometrium and how to clinically allow the growth of this thin endometrium. Then if that woman suffers from thrombophilia, she is the candidate for low molecular weight heparin. If she is suffering from any genetic defects, then we may go for an ERA. That is, if her window of implantation is altered. If we feel that embryo is not secreting adequate HCG, then probably we may have to do a PGS. Or if we are seeing that the embryo quality every time is abnormal, we may have to do a karyotype in the husband and the wife. Immunological causes, if they are found, I told you how to check for Th1/2 immunity and the NK cells. Then we have to give immunomodulators like tacrolimus, IVIG, peripheral blood mononuclear cells, or GCSF. If we find that the endometrial genome signature or the endometrial fluid is positive for bacterial genomes which are pathological, not the lactobacilli but the others, then we should give specific antibiotics, cure them of infection, and then transfer. Altered molecules or endometrial receptivity, we can use endometrial injury as a method to treat GCSF, or we may go for ERA and personalized embryo transfer. Other factors are we should be able to produce very healthy embryos in our laboratory. If we have severe male factor, we must do a karyotype in the husband and also do certain DNA fragmentation index tests or HOS tests to know whether the DNA in that sperm are intact or not. Otherwise, we will again land into a implantation failure or a miscarriage. If the husband is smoking or his environment is not good, that can be changed. And we should optimize the IVF protocol such that we get genetically healthy oocytes. I think this is all what we can do. And almost in all the patients, either we will give them a successful pregnancy, but if they have certain important genetic defects, the only answer for them which we will have is a surrogacy. I leave this open for discussion. Hello.
Hello, doctor.
Yeah, tell me.
Yeah, so you're done with the session. So
Yes.
I request other doctors to ask any questions if you have any.
Anybody is there? I'll ask I'll give a couple's history and then we can discuss it out. Hello?
Yes, doctor.
Anyone's there?
So yes, people are here, but they're not
I'll,
raising.
I'll just give a history of a couple, and then we can discuss how can we
Yeah,
manage this.
right.
Uh, yeah. Now this is a couple which has undergone IVF 7 times, and every time she has undergone blastocyst transfer, and she has not shown implantation, or she's always shown a negative pregnancy test. And in this case, what will you do? All her tests are normal. Her endometrium on the day of implantation is nice and 9 millimeters progestational. When we start HCG, it is around 9.5 or 10, triple line. Absolutely nothing has been found. No hydrosalpinx. Absolutely no problem. Unexplained infertility couple. Woman's age is just 31 years. So what will we do for this couple? Anyone in the participants? Yeah, anyone? Ma'am, are they hearing?
Hello.
Yeah.
Hello. You can
Tell me.
surrogacy can be done here.
Would you like to do certain investigations?
Yes, you said all investigations are normal.
But we did not do any immunological investigations of her endometrium. It was not available that time.
Yes. Now you can do it.
Yeah. So actually what happened in her is we were not knowing about, how to do this NK cell count inside the endometrium. We did not have anyone doing immunohistochemistry, but we gave her IVIG and we got a successful pregnancy.
Okay. Immunological problem.
Immunological. It was definitely an immunological problem, and she delivered a healthy baby boy.
Very good.
One common question I would like to ask everyone, I mean, in their day-to-day practice, that we usually, what we do is we look at the endometrium. Supposing we are doing a frozen embryo transfer, we look at the endometrium on whatever 10, 9, 8th day of our estrogens. When it is above 9 millimeters, we start progesterone. And when you give progesterone on day 5, supposing the endometrium becomes 6 mm, what are we going to do? Day 5 or 6 of progesterone, endometrium becomes 6 mm.
Day 5 of day 6.
Of progesterone. So when we had given estrogen, it grew. We are continuing estrogen and then we are giving progesterone, because we know that after 5 or 6 days of progesterone only we are going to do an embryo transfer. And now it shrinks. So what do? Do we transfer or we don't transfer?
No, you should not transfer.
Supposing it shrinks to 8 millimeters.
Hello.
Yeah. Yeah, tell
Hello.
me. Yeah, tell me. Is anyone?
Madam, Dr. Juhi here, madam.
Yeah, hi.
Hello, ma'am.
Hi, tell me.
Ma'am, I think we'll go ahead with the transfer, ma'am, because after progesterone support, sometimes it shrinks the endometrium. So if after estrogen it was good, then I think we should go ahead.
Yeah, now see, I'll tell you, if in the last lecture, what did we say? We said that there is a proliferation of the stromal cells which get compacted during progestational phase. And so if there is a strong compaction of stromal cells, the endometrium shrinks. And this gives a better pregnancy rate than when the endometrial expands. In that, there is more edema. Whereas here, there is more compaction of the stromal cells. And stromal cells are the most important cells as far as the implantation of embryo is concerned. But what should we take as a cutoff? So will you transfer in the 6 mm or you will transfer in the 8 mm?
Above 7.
Hmm?
Above 7.
Yeah, at least above 7.5. See, there are two thoughts. There are many research papers on this. Some say you should take 7 as a cutoff, but they don't tell you on which day. Day of starting progesterone or day 5 or day 6 of progesterone. So one of the recent papers, this is our day-to-day clinical problem. So there are two schools of thought. Some say that if it compacts till 7 mm, you can still go ahead with an embryo transfer. And the others say if it becomes lesser than 6 mm, we may not go in for a embryo transfer. What will you do then? Supposing it has become 6 mm and you have cancelled, you're not going to do a frozen embryo. So what are you going to do? Yes, Dr. Juhi.
I think we'll go ahead, madam.
Even at 6 mm.
Because it has compacted it. I mean,
It has, I know, it has, but you're going to take out frozen embryos and you would definitely like to be a little more careful. I wouldn't transfer at 6 mm. Next time, I would give her a little lesser dose of progesterone.
Okay.
Right. Anything you can do to check the blood flow?
Doppler.
Yeah, we can do the radial artery Doppler and see the resistance of radial artery. And if it is high, will you transfer?
No.
What will you do then?
Then give sildenafil or
Yeah,
vitamin.
sildenafil you can give. Correct. You can give sildenafil because
Vitamin
it
E.
will. Correct. I'm talking to.
Dr. Geeta Chevgan.
Oh yes, मी तेच आवाज ऐकला. Okay, great. Yeah, perfect. So
You
we
are
have.
very perfect, Manju. You are
No,
everything
what
is
I
very
want to tell everyone who is doing IVF is be very stringent on the day of embryo transfer. IVF people have become very lucky because freezing has become a boon. We can always segment the cycle we have any doubts, we can investigate thoroughly, be very sure that the endometrium is going to accept our embryo. So if we want to run a successful program, we should have an excellent embryo preparing lab and a very, very headstrong clinician who will not go ahead with embryo transfer if she has the slightest doubt that this patient can fail. And at the same time, we should have a very, very strong vitrification program. And I'm very sure every patient coming to your clinic very confidently will say, yes, I'm going to be happy here and I'm going to go happily from here. Doesn't matter if she has to wait for 2 months, 3 months, 6 months, 8 months, that is not a problem. But if you transfer embryos in a wrong endometrium or you transfer wrong embryos in the right endometrium, you will never get a pregnancy. And a failed pregnancy is the saddest part for the doctor and the patient. One more case you want, or everybody is tired?
Hey, you can tell.
Anyone else in the group?
Yes, ma'am. One more case, ma'am.
Okay, we'll take one more case. Patient was having 2 or 3 previous IVF failures. And now this case, no, see what happens is recurrent implantation failure and recurrent pregnancy loss are, very related. And we say again that the early pregnancy losses mostly are chromosomal, but we rarely look at these things like thrombophilia or any immunological problems that we don't look at. We just tell our patients, within 8 weeks, you lost your pregnancy. That means it is probably something with your pregnancy. And nowadays we have all these genetic tests, whole genome of the lost embryo, which comes out to be normal. Never we have got our aneuploidy screening showing lot of aneuploidy embryos. So still there is something in the endometrium. So this is a patient I'm discussing long back, which I saw, where every time she used to become pregnant, she used to develop a RP clot. And then this RP clot used to increase in size and then she used to abort by 2.5 to 3 months. And we went into a lot of literature, and because she was a very close friend of mine and she had no one to trust and I had no one to ask, because everything we knew about abortion is tender loving care. So we went into certain research papers. I discussed with Dr. Firoza Parikh from Mumbai, and then we thought we will give her immunoglobulins. And that is how we first started using immunoglobulins. To my surprise, after 5 losses, the first time we gave her immunoglobulin, as soon as we saw an RP clot, we gave her immunoglobulins at 8 weeks of pregnancy. And we kept giving her every month till 28 weeks of pregnancy, and she had a healthy baby. Then again she conceived, again she developed an RP clot, and again we gave her for 7-8 months, we gave her every month immunoglobulins, and she got a healthy pregnancy. So something immunoglobulins are doing, what they are doing with the allo or the autoimmunity, I'm not understanding. But that time my simple reasoning was that the embryo is a foreign tissue and the killer cells, which are bad, will eat it unless that foreign tissue is covered with globulins, that is immunoglobulins. So immunoglobulins cover the tropoplastic villi and the NK cells will not eat my villi. So that was the simple reasoning which I put. Even today, the science of implantation as to why this foreign tissue comes inside the womb, stays and grows inside the womb for 9 months and then comes out is still a big mystery. Much is not known. We are still trying to hope, but with little experiences, we realize that something is happening, though we do not have all the tools to investigate as to what is happening. Any questions?
Does anything do with blood group different of husband and wife with this?
Not at all. Not at all. Never. Anyone else? I think we just end this topic here. We still have a long way, many more discussions. Next time we are going to speak on thin endometrium.
Okay.
Sure, doctor. So,
Okay.
Doctor, before just ending the session, I'm being very naive to this therapy itself. So, I was just going through a lot of guidelines from different bodies like ESHRE and all. So, I have just come across one statement, where ESHRE has mentioned that stress is associated with RPL, and but couples should be informed that there is no evidence that stress is a direct cause of pregnancy loss. So, what is your take on that? So is it
Although
actually
stress causes release of corticosteroids.
okay? Right,
And
right.
corticosteroids alters the immunity, which can lead to implantation failure. That is why this recent paper in 2018 say that if you keep your patients stress-free, implantation rates improve.
Oh,
Because it actually increases or changes the immunity in the endometrium.
okay. And doctor, medical and family history could be used to like tell a diagnostic investigation in RPL. So this is also
Yes, of
mentioned in
course. Of course, those who are having recurrent abortions in their family could be
right.
carriers of certain abnormal genetic material.
Okay. I was like totally shocked by reading that your medical history can also play an important role.
Of course, we are all just carrying our DNA in time.
Right.
So,
Which gene can become dominant at what phase
yeah,
you never
and
know.
nature wants to select the best.
Right, true.
Fine,
Okay.
ma'am.
Thank
Chalo,
you so
thank
much,
you.
doctor, for
Yeah,
such a
we'll
fantastic
let you know
session.
the next date on
Sure,
maybe next month or so. Yeah,
sure.
fine.
Okay.
Thank
Thank
you.
you
Bye
so much,
bye.
everyone, for joining.
Bye.
Bye.
Thanks, everyone.